My name is Darcy, and I'm one of your friendly neighborhood librarians here at the East Baton Rouge Parish Library. Today, I'm going to be showing you how to make a felt magnolia. If you picked up a kit from the library, you should have one sheet of templates, one piece of white felt, a small piece of brown felt, a small piece of green felt, a small piece of yellow felt, 3 pipe cleaners, a needle in a sharps container, some light colored thread, some dark colored thread, and a roll of brown floral tape. You'll also need a pair of scissors. If you didn't pick up the kit, no worries. All of these things should be easily available to you at a craft store, and the templates are linked below. So the first thing we're going to do to make this project is cut out our templates. You're going to cut all of them out all the way around, except you don't need to cut out these kind of little teeth on this yellow piece yet. We'll do that when we cut out the felt. So now that all of our pattern pieces are cut out, we're actually going to go ahead and cut out the pieces in felt. These are all the bits we're going to need to make our flowers except for the stem, which is going to be made out of pipe cleaners. So each pattern piece is labeled with how many pieces you need to cut out of felt and the color of felt you're going to use. So this is the center of our flower. We're going to cut it out of yellow and we only need one. These 3 are the 3 different sizes of petals. We'll want 3 copies of each in felt. And then this is our leaf. So we want 1 green and 1 brown because magnolia leaves are kind of funky where they're dark green on the top and kind of a rusty brown underneath. So the trickiest part is going to be cutting out 9 white petals from 1 sheet of felt. So make sure you're kind of managing your felt positioning well. Start on the corners and try and keep them well organized and use as much of the felt as possible. So that's what I'm going to start with. So it doesn't have to be perfect. Flowers are not, perfectly symmetrical necessarily, and your cuts don't have to be perfect. We'll go back through and clean everything up. Once you cut out 1 petal from each pattern piece, I find it's actually easier to use a felt piece as your pattern because felt kind of sticks to felt. You just got to be careful that you're not trimming the edges too hard as you cut out the one underneath. And so we're going to keep cutting. If you're going to have your pattern not line up, go with the bottom not being smooth. That part's all going to be hidden. So if you have to cut a little bit off of your pattern pieces or your felt pieces to make everything fit, then leave as much space at the top as you can, but cut off bits from this kind of base of the petal. So all of my petals are rough cut out, and as you can see, I did not have a lot of felt left over. So be careful when you're cutting. The little ones are actually the most important. I probably should have started cutting those first because those are the ones you're going to see the most in the center of the flower. If you have to sacrifice 1 petal, sacrifice 1 of the large ones. It'll just look like your flower has maybe lost a petal or 2. So now that we've cut out all of our petals, we're going to cut out both sides of our leaf and the center yellow section. If you are impatient like me, you can actually cut both sides of your leaf at the same time. Just stack up your felt, kind of stick your little football-shaped template into a corner so you're not wasting, just in case, and trim. Theoretically, you should have 2 perfectly sized leaf pieces. So for your center yellow section, you can very carefully cut the same little indentions along the top of your felt, but if you don't want to fuss around with holding up the template the whole time, you're basically just cutting little bits about 1 inch deep into the fabric. Like so. If we need to go through and trim some of them down, either make them deeper cuts or trim off the tops when we go to wrap it, we can do that. That's not a problem. So now that all of my templates are cut out, I'm actually going to start working on the petals. Before we start stitching them up, we're actually going to go ahead and tidy up the edges. You want your cut lines to be as smooth as you can because this will be pretty noticeable once your flower is done. And now that all of our pieces have been kind of trimmed down and smoothed out, we can start with the stitching. So first you're going to open up your little needle packet carefully. And you're going to take your light colored thread and trim off a piece that's about as long as your your hand to forearm. You're going to thread your needle. And because I hate threading needles and am bad at keeping the thread on, I usually tie one little knot right there at the end. We're going to get started with our biggest petals first so we can kind of see how it goes and get some practice in before we work on the little ones. Magnolia petals are really, really cupped. So we're actually going to stitch 2 places on each petal. We're going to adjust a couple of tiny stitches right there at the top to make the top of our petal cup in. And then here, we're going to actually stitch a line of stitches at an angle right here to cup in again on our petal. So we got 2 places where it will kind of make the petal hold its little cup shape. So we'll start at the top. I'm just going to fold my petal in half, and then I'm going to put the needle in through the tip-ish. You can't go too close to the tip because the felt will rip. And I didn't tie a knot at the end of my thread, so I'm going to bring it through about that much. And now I'm going to tie a knot. And another knot. And then I'm going to give it 2 more stitches right here, and then tie another knot. And then we're going to snip our thread pretty close to that knot, just so it's less noticeable. So that is our first little stitch. We're going to do that to all of our petals. And now here, for the base stitches, we're going to do the same thing we did to start at the top stitches, which is fold our petal in half. We're going to stitch up relatively close to the end, but not at the end. Tie 1 knot, well, a double knot, to get ourselves a little tail. And now for the stitching. So I'm going to start, I put my double knot pretty close in. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the fabric, probably right about there. Pull my thread through, and I'm going to stitch up to about here on the petal, but I'm going to go at an angle. So we're going to make a very long triangle with our stitches here. I'm just going to use a basic running stitch, and I'm going to come back down so I can tie off on this tail again. So I stitched all the way up with just a little running stitch, and now I'm going to stitch all the way back down just to give it some reinforcement. Right, and now I'm going to tie off my threads with a double knot and trim them off. So that is our basic petals. So we're going to stretch it a little bit. See if we can get it to cup a little bit more. But that is what they look like. So we're going to do that for all 9 of our petals, and then we'll come back here and see what the next step is. Okay, so all 9 of our petals have been stitched, both the little tips and the kind of ribs in the back to give them a cup shape. So this next part is optional. I think it makes them look more authentic, but it's totally up to you. What I like to do is go in for each petal and snip off a kind of a rounded edge, the very tip of that felt that wasn't stitched. You don't want to cut any of your stitches, but it just makes it look a little bit more like a magnolia. Magnolias don't really have kind of pointy tips on the ends of their petals, but when you crimp the ends like this, it creates that like little nubbins. So I'm going to go ahead and trim all those off on all of my petals. But like I said, make sure you're not cutting any of your stitches. That would be bad. You would have to stitch it again. Don't want that. There we go. So now that our petals are done, we're going to work with our yellow felt and start the center of our flower. So you'll need your yellow trimmed piece. Be careful with your little bits. I accidentally pulled one of the little trimmed bits off. It's not the end of the world. You'll need 2 of your pipe cleaners and you'll need your threaded needle. You probably still want to just leave that light colored thread on there. So the first thing we're going to do is actually take 2 of our pipe cleaners together and fold a little loop in the top. So you've got kind of a nubbins and your sharp bits aren't sticking out. We're just going to kind of wrap those around each other. And then we'll twist them up a little bit. This is going to be the central branch of our flower, basically, what everything's built onto. So we want it to be good and sturdy. Now, the way that the center of the flower comes together is actually really simple. You start on the widest end of your yellow trimmed felt, and you're going to roll it in on itself. Maybe 2 or 3 rolls. You want to keep it pretty tight as you really can get it. And you want to keep the bottom flush. So you've got a little nubbins begun. Now you're going to kind of fit in the center piece where you folded your pipe cleaners and keep wrapping tight. Just be careful with your ends, your trimmed ends up top. So that is what your center is going to look like. So actually, I told you to keep it flush. Once you've got your pipe cleaner bits in there, you can kind of start letting the felt angle down a little bit as you wrap. And that just makes it not quite as bulky. It makes it more like pine cone shaped, which is kind of how the centers of magnolias are shaped. That is pretty good. So it's not attached to itself right now at all. That's okay. We're going to set it down. Felt holds together pretty well. We're going to get our needle ready again. So I haven't tied a knot in the tail. I've still got it threaded at the top. What I'm going to do is pick a spot where I know I've got all of the bulk of my felt, so even the very center, and the pipe cleaners. I'm just going to go in and all the way through. I had to unwrap mine a little bit to get there. And we're not going to pull the thread all the way through. You're going to leave yourself a good little tail, put your thumb on that, hold it tight, and then you're going to come back through the whole bundle from the other side again. Oop, don't pull it too tight. Pull it a little bit tight, and then we're going to tie a knot. And that we want to pull very tight, but don't snap your thread. And we're going to double knot it, of course. There we go. So now that we have our thread anchored on there pretty well, we're going to give it another stitch or 2 here, and then we're going to pull this guy tight and stitch everybody up. So once you've got a good number of stitches in there, you can go ahead and wrap your thread around just a little bit. Again, we're just kind of smoothing things out here at the bottom, but don't trim it. We are going to snip this little tail that has a knot, though. So we've trimmed our tail. We've got the center of our magnolia started, good to go, really. And we've still got a working end on our needle. So now we're going to take our smallest petals. We've got 3. And you're going to take the first one and you're going to open it up like a little book here at the bottom. So you've got our stitched center. That's about how high I stitched them. You're going to open it up and you're going to set it against the center of your flower like so. You're going to take your working end of your needle and stitch up through the white of your first petal, whoop, so that it is tentatively attached. So we're up through the first petal. Now we're going to stitch down through the entire through the petal and through the entire base of the flower, so it comes out the other side. And we're going to go up through everything again and down again. So it's not super well held on there, but that is our first petal attached. Now we're going to take our next petal and you're going to place it, oops, open it up again. And we're going to place it so that the white edges touch or almost touch. They don't need to overlap at all. And again, we're going to stitch up through the petal for the first time, down through the whole thing, up through the whole thing, and down again. All right, and now we're going to attach our last small petal, same way. They can overlap a little bit, but we're really not looking for overlap. Okay, so that is the base of our magnolia. We've got our first 3 petals on. The rest of the petals go on in a very similar way. We're going to move up to our next size. And for these petals, because we're going to fill in our gaps basically. So you're going to open up the bases like a book, overlap them so they cover the space between the 2 small petals that's open for each side. So same deal. All right, so that is our 3 little petals, our 3 medium petals. That has our 3 little petals, our 3 medium petals sewn on now. So we're going to add our 3 large petals. They're going to mirror the tiny petals in the middle, or the small petals in the middle. But you can also just kind of put them where you think it looks the best. These are what really kind of give that magnolia a very open feeling. But they stitch on the exact same way. So I did have to rethread my needle, and I am actually going to tie a good couple of knots in the end of my thread now because the flower is very bulky at this point and it's kind of difficult to hold the thread and make everything tie together that way. So if we give ourselves a ready-made knot in the end of our tail, it usually takes me 7 or 8 knots to get one large enough that won't pull through. We can start it in the same point where our last working thread finished up. Just thread on through. Give it a couple of stitches and then we'll come back and tie those 2 together. So Now we'll tie our tails together, just so nothing comes loose. So now that we've finished our stitching here, we're going to do just like we did with the center of the flower. We're going to wrap some of this extra thread around and around just to try and lessen that bulk. Be careful with your needle, but don't de-thread it yet, because we're going to give it another stitch or two just to hold this wrapping in place. So that's a pretty decent wrap. I'm going to just stitch it through the center a couple of times just to hold that wrap in place. And then we're going to tie a knot by stitching our needle through a little chunk of fabric that's pretty close together, so we get a loop, and then you go through the loop and through the loop again and pull, and you've got a little bit of a knot. And then we'll do that one more time. This will all be covered, so it's not really going to matter that it doesn't look good, and the knot doesn't have to be super stable, but you don't want anything popping apart. All right, and now we're going to trim off our threaded section, and that is the base of our magnolia. We're can kind of squeezle things around, but that's a pretty nice looking flower so far. So yeah, next we're going to work on the leaf. All right, to make our leaf, we're going to need both cutout pieces, our dark thread, the needle of course, scissors, and the last pipe cleaner. So first thing we're going to do is fold our pipe cleaner a little bit so that it has a rounded tip. We don't want anyone to be stabbed. And then we're just going to wrap that tail around itself. So once we have our pipe cleaner set up, we're going to go ahead and thread our needle with some of our dark thread. Again, you want a piece about as long as your forearm, maybe a little bit longer, but you don't want too much working thread. It's just irritating. And we're going to thread our needle. And I am going to tie a knot here in the back. But we're going to start one actually. And then we're going to slip it onto our pipe cleaner. And we want it to start right about where the bottom of your leaf would overlap. Yeah, right about there. So now we're going to stitch our pipe cleaner to our leaf right down the center. If you stitch the pipe cleaner directly to the green leaf, your stitches on top will be seen, and that's fine. That might look cool. If you don't want to have to worry about that, you can go ahead and stitch your pipe cleaner to the brown side so the dark thread will match, and you don't have to worry about it being seen so much. So we're going to go down through our brown fabric to just get it started, back up, and then up and over the pipe cleaner. And then we go over a little bit, up, over the pipe cleaner. And you don't want to pull it too tight because you don't really want it to like curve around the pipe cleaner. You just want it to be held really well. As we get to the end of stitching our pipe cleaner down to our brown, we're going to attempt to get through the loop on the pipe cleaner with our needle. This is just so it doesn't accidentally slide out the front at all. So our pipe cleaner is now attached to our brown felt. My stitches were not careful, so they're pretty haphazard, but if you were very careful, you'd have two perfectly straight lines of stitches running down the middle of your leaf. So if you wanted to put this on the green, that's totally fine. Or you could do crisscross if you wanted. See, I did a couple of stitches wrong. So now that we have our pipe cleaner attached to the bottom of our leaf, we're going to set the top of our leaf on top. So our thread is through the very bottom. We're going to set the green part of our leaf on top. Arrange it pleasingly. And we're going to stitch up through the brown and the green. And we're just going to stitch the two pieces of felt together all around the edge. So we went ahead and finished stitching around the edge of our leaf. I just tied a little knot at the end. If you want, you can stitch down the middle and tie your knot down here at the base of the leaf where it's slightly less noticeable, but I don't really think you can see it, and I'm fine with leaving it without that center seam. So now that our leaf is done and our flower is done, the bases, we're going to wrap the stems with our floral tape. You've got a little roll of brown floral tape in your bag. You shouldn't have to use too much of it, but we'll get a good covering. Floral tape is weird. It's got like a waxy substance on it and it stretches a little bit, but that helps you wrap tightly around your stems. So unfortunately I wrapped these already and had to pull them off because the video wasn't recording. So we're going to squinch our leaf down just a tiny bit on our pipe cleaner, just so we're uncovering the very tip here. I'm going to start with the end of our floral tape and we're just going to set it as close to the start of the leaf as we can. Pinch it really tight and then twist around at a little bit of an angle. And then we're going to keep twisting up and covering some of our previous piece of floral tape with the next wrap. Just like that. And now I'm going to squinch it down a little bit, so we don't see any of the pipe cleaner poking out at the end. And we're just going to twist all the way to the end of this guy. And that is our first little wrap. Now it's a little rough. You can see some of the green through it, so I'm actually going to angle my tape down again. You can also just rip it and do another wrap. You just want to try and keep things tight and twisted because that's what's going to keep the floral wrap in place. And when I get down here to the base, I'm just going to rip it and smoosh the end into the rest of my tape. And that is your first little stem. So your fingers will be pretty sticky. It's very waxy, but that's okay. The more you work with the floral tape, kind of the warmer it gets and the better it sticks to itself. So for our flower stem, these two pipe cleaners are not quite strong enough to hold it up. So we're actually going to trim the ends flush, which I've already done. Don't use your nice scissors for this, and fold it in half. And we're going to twist our pipe cleaners together. So that'll create a more sturdy stem. So we're going to start at the top again. I'm going to cover up all of this section up here where I wrapped things in the stitches. So I'm going to start about there. We'll come back and make another loop. And you're just going to hold with one finger and wrap tightly with the other, but not too tightly. The tape will rip. You just kind of have to figure out exactly what pressure you want to add. And we're just going to wrap all the way down the stem. And you can rip it there at the end and kind of tuck, tuck, tuck. All right, so that's not too bad actually. I covered a lot of my threads, but I'm going to give it a little bit more up here. We're going to start a little bit higher this time. And I think that will be good. So you notice it's really puffed up right here. If you just keep angling your tape down, you can just cover up all of that with the next wrap of floral tape. And I think that's pretty good. So we're going to trim it there because I'm a little bit low on tape. And that's not a bad look. Now to connect our two stems, we're going to set our leaf where kind of we want it to sit on our flower arrangement. I think that'll be good. And I'm going to start my tape here at the top where I want them to connect. And I'm just going to wrap the stems together all the way down. And I have just enough tape to make it work. All right. And now our stem is complete. So our leaf is attached. Now, if you're doing this at home, you should have twice as much floral tape because you don't have to do it twice. You want to double back up again once you get to the end, just so that the bond between the two stems is nice and sturdy and it won't rip here. But this will be fine for now. So now your flower is complete. You've got a posable stem, so you can make it into a hook and you could hang your flower. You could wrap it around a post. It would stay very well. However you want to let it hang out. Your leaf can be shifted around because it's wired in there. And you can kind of floof your little flower out. And that is how you do it. You have successfully made a lovely felt magnolia. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Hopefully we'll see y'all next time. Thanks. Bye.